This is 21st Century Reformation at 21stcr.org. Dustin, John 1:18. This is a often talked about verse, and I think it's a great verse, but there's a little bit of a question about the text here. Talk to us about John 1:18. What do people make of it, and then what are the textual issues?
I think you can almost break it into 3, maybe even 4 parts. I'm going to read it from my translation here. This is the New American Standard, and it starts off and it says, "No one has seen God at any time." And then my translation says, "The only begotten God," we'll come back and talk about that, "who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." The first part of the verse, which should seem fairly straightforward to many readers, hasn't actually quite been taken seriously, where it says, "No one has seen God at any time." It's interesting. No one has ever seen God, but people clearly see Jesus throughout his ministry all over the place. So that should at least signify that Jesus is not God in the sense of this passage. But then it talks about this one who is the only begotten, and then we actually have some textual variants here. We have some differences in the manuscripts. This is not a very common thing when it comes to verses like this. But you can see there are other translations that have adopted the reading, "the only begotten Son." And actually, I'm going to argue that the only begotten Son is the more likely reading, because you can read elsewhere in the book of John, John 3:16, where everyone is familiar, where it says, "The only begotten Son, and whoever so believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life." You can see this only begotten Son or uniquely begotten Son in quite a few places. It does show up in chapter 3. It shows up in verse 16. It also shows up in verse 18. And I think it also shows up in the book of 1 John. So you see, this is a common way that John uses this phrase. He uses the uniquely begotten Son. He's the only begotten Son. Obviously, he wasn't born, by the way, in the manner that you and I have been born, because God created him miraculously in the womb of Mary, as we see in Matthew 1 and Luke 1. So it's likely that that's the variant, and that perhaps the tendency of the scribes to want to say that Jesus is God maybe pushed them to alter some of the texts, and that's likely what happened there. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
I love what you're saying. I think back to your first thought, no man has seen God at any time. Mm-hmm. It is interesting that by the time John was writing this, mm-hmm. Jesus had been here walking among the people.
Yeah.
And John is still affirming here, no one's seen God. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting in 1 John 4 and 12, I think it is, where that John is writing in the epistle, in mm-hmm. the letter, no man has seen God at any time. So it seems very clear to me that if Jesus was God, he wouldn't be wanting to somehow or another be emphasizing about nobody has seen God at any time.
Yeah.
And I think that seems pretty solid. So if you begin with that part of the verse, mm-hmm. there's no textual question there. So we know that he's saying from the very beginning, no man has seen God at any time. So whatever else he's going to say will not somehow contradict that.
Right. I think what the passage is initially doing is that by the time you get to the end of it, it says this person who is Jesus, who is currently in the bosom of the Father from the perspective of when he's writing this, Jesus resurrected and sitting at the right hand of God. He has explained him, and actually in Greek it's the word exegesis. It's Jesus has exegeted the Father. No one has seen God at all, but Jesus shows us what God is like. Okay, so in a sense, people when they look at Jesus, there's a sense that they can actually see through him and see God, and this is clarified by other passages in John. You can look starting in all sorts of places. I mean, in chapter 14, where Jesus says, "No one comes to the Father but through me." Notice it's through him that people can actually get and have access to God. Jesus says, "If you had known me," verse 7, "you would have known my Father also. From now on you know him and you have seen him." Jesus is like, "You've actually seen the Father." Well, wait a minute. We just read that no one has ever seen God. So, of course, Philip rightly says, "Lord, show us the Father, and it's enough for us." Jesus responds, and he says, "He who has seen me has seen the Father." The point being that Jesus explains God to us. He shows us what God is like. He demonstrates his love, compassion, forgiveness, his will, his desire, his hope for humanity, and his message of the kingdom of God. So Jesus shows us exactly what God is like. Even though no one has seen God, we can actually see God through Jesus. And this is getting a little further. This is probably what is meant at the end of John's Gospel, when Thomas can look at Jesus and say, I get it now. I can look at Jesus and say, my Lord and my God, because this theme that has been going through John's Gospel, that if you see Jesus, you see the Father, and Jesus exegeted the Father, has shown us what God is like. Thomas finally gets at the very end. And so there's this running theme starting from 1:18, probably ending in verse 28.
I like that too. It's interesting to me then, we have to realize that because Jesus, we can see the Father in him, and certainly we do, in his life, his actions, and all that he did. We see the Father. It does not really make Jesus God, or doesn't make him the Father.
Yeah.
And we as Christians, I think most Christians would recognize that you should be seeing Christ in us.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't literally one for one make us Christ. And so it is, I think, with Jesus. Jesus has shown us the Father. He's demonstrated him, illustrated him, given us a life, living example of what God is like. And yet, that doesn't mean that Jesus himself is God. I like your thought about begotten, too. You have to wonder about the view now carried by some of our translations, the NRSV and IB, the only begotten God business.
Yeah.
It just seems a little strange to me, because what would a begotten God be?
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, it would seem to imply, if that is the real reading, that God was brought into existence, and therefore you have a God who was born, and in some sense that actually takes away from God. And also, it would really make the verse very awkward. It would seem to indicate, if that is the reading, that no one has seen God, but we have the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, who is obviously God. So there you actually have two gods. And that doesn't make sense.
This isn't working well at all.
It doesn't work. It doesn't fit there, because even in John's Gospel, it's in John 17:3 that you, Father, are the only true God, and there's only one God, and even the Jews only have one God, and that's a presupposed thing. Right. But the whole point of John's Gospel is that Jesus is revealing God. He is the agent. He is the one that God has sent. And therefore, God forgives sins, so Jesus can forgive sins because God has invested that authority in him. God raises the dead, so Jesus can raise the dead. God gives life, so Jesus can give life. And all the opponents, the Jews, a technical term in John's Gospel, they're the ones that are saying, you really don't have this authority. You really aren't representing God. And by you claiming that you're representing God, and we don't think that you do, from their perspective, they think that they're blaspheming God, or that Jesus claims they're doing that. So
really, going back to the textual question,
sure.
Really, the textual view, and it is carried by many of our translations, including the Venerable King James.
Yeah.
But the textual view is that the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, that's wonderful. Rather than the only begotten God, which is a little strange. We start out saying nobody's seen God, so that doesn't seem to work with that. We have an only begotten God. The idea of a God being begotten is really strange.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be verified in any other way, I think, in the Scriptures. And then so here we are, I think, in the rush to say, oh, Jesus must be God. We want to find anything we can, grasping at theological straws, as it were. We're going to grab onto that variant that would say only begotten God, which is really just strange. I don't think it works.
Yeah, and I think it's not very helpful to just pick the variant which suits your theology, and I'm trying not to do that. One of the things that I tried to do is to demonstrate that John, typically when he uses this begotten language, it is always only begotten Son.
Excellent.
Okay? And it's much more likely that a scribe in the 3rd and 4th centuries, when you have these disputes about the identity of Jesus, it's much more likely that they're going to change it and exalt Jesus than to change it and drop it from God down to Son. That wouldn't make any sense. So you have a motive behind that. And the fact that the original reading, if it was only begotten God, it wouldn't make any sense. What is that trying to convey? Yeah. So I'm trying to argue based on those reasons as opposed to what may or may not suit my own theology.
Yeah. And so it matches so much better, I think, than when we consider that. And we've got Galatians 4:4, Paul is going to tell us that the Son of God was begotten in a woman. Well, it's the Son. It's this human being that was actually begotten, not a God.
Absolutely.
That's a very strange business.
Yeah.
And also John 3:16, for goodness sake, just a little bit later from this. This only begotten Son. That rings right. It
Absolutely.
makes sense. And the business about a begotten God, I think I wouldn't put much stock in that.
Yeah.
It doesn't work very well.
It's probably best to not latch on to one verse and build theology around it. You need to look at the entire corpus, or at least in this regard, John's Gospel. One of the interesting facts that I've noted is that John, the Gospel of John, will call Jesus a man, a human being, more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined.
Wow.
Why is that? I mean, it's interesting because most people, they go to John because they think that's got the highest Christology.
Yeah.
When it's interesting that John emphasizes the humanity of Jesus more than the other Gospels.
Yes.
Is that because perhaps there's a dispute on the identity of Jesus that John is trying to settle, rebuke? He's trying to put some water on that fire, and he has to emphasize that Jesus is a human being. In fact, even Jesus himself in John 18, when he's before Pilate, Jesus says that he was born. We want to take all these things into consideration when we look at a passage like this.
Excellent. It's interesting that actually for me, as I was reconsidering my understanding of these matters some years back, John is what greatly convinced me that Jesus was not God.
Yeah.
John does a wonderful job in what he presents in clarifying that Jesus is not equal to God.
Right.
We have the John 14:28, my Father is greater than I, or John 10, where Jesus is saying, my Father is greater than everybody, all, which would include himself. So you begin to look at John and take your tradition glasses off, so the traditional glasses, and look at him for what he's really saying. Suddenly, Jesus becomes wonderful as the true human Messiah.
Absolutely.
I love that, yeah.
Maybe I would add a couple more passages to help.
Go ahead.
I think, and just to show that Jesus is the one that explains God, he reveals God, he's God's agent. Just sticking in John's Gospel, by the way. In John 5:37, Jesus says, "The Father who sent me, he testifies of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time, nor seen his form." He's saying, look, you haven't seen God, okay?
That's right.
But he sent me because I can reveal his will and his purposes for the world. Even in the same passage of verse 43, Jesus, "I have come in my Father's name, and you don't receive me." Well, he said, "I come in the Father's name. I have his authority. I have his invested presence in this world. And by not receiving him, they're also not receiving the Father as well." That's the typical principle of agency that we see there. And then even in chapter 17, one last passage, 17 verse 6, where Jesus says, he's praying to God, he's praying to the Father. He says, "I have manifested your name to men whom you gave me." I'm revealing, I'm unveiling, I am showing people your name and everything you're about. And it's even in that chapter, it's these are the people whom you gave me. Whom you gave me, it actually shows up in that passage twice, or shows up in that verse twice, shows up in the passage, a half dozen times. So again, if we take John seriously, we could see that what is being spoken of in 1:18 best can be summarized as no one has ever seen God, but you got Jesus, who's God's uniquely begotten Son, who is right now currently in this close relationship in the bosom of the Father. He is revealing God. He is explaining God. He has shown us what God is like in the fullest sense, better than any other person, prophet, king has ever done.
And we can see God in the man Christ Jesus.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what John's really getting at. That's what he wants his readers to understand.
Right.
We have seen God in the person of Jesus Christ. Not because Jesus is God, for goodness sakes. That would be a terrible confusion. But because he does give us God, represents God to us. And that's wonderful. And that was the will of God, that his Son would do that.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
I like that.
I like it a lot too.